Somewhere in Africa, roughly 120,000 years ago, the rain stopped. Not for a week, not for a season, for generations. The lakes shrank to nothing. The rivers turned to cracked mud. The animals that your ancestors depended on either died or walked away to find water somewhere else. And your ancestors had a choice: move or die. Most of them died. We know this because of what the DNA tells us. At some point during this period, the entire human population on Earth collapsed to somewhere between 1 and 10,000 individuals. Not 1,000 dead, 1,000 alive. Every single human being on this planet today is descended from that tiny group of survivors. We almost didn't make it, and the reason we did is stranger than any survival story you've ever heard. Let's start with what the drought actually looked like. The African humid period had kept the continent green and wet for thousands of years. Rivers ran wide, lakes held water year-round, game was abundant. Your ancestors had built their entire way of life around that abundance. Then it ended. Paleoclimatologists studying sediment cores from East African lakes have found the evidence preserved in the rock, layer by layer, the record of a world drying out, pollen disappearing, dust layers thickening, water levels dropping by meters, then tens of meters. Lake Malawi, one of the deepest lakes in the world, dropped by at least 500 meters during this period. Not slowly, catastrophically. The savanna that your ancestors had hunted across for hundreds of thousands of years turned to dust. So what did they do? The first thing was movement. Hunter-gatherer groups that had lived in the same territory for generations were suddenly forced to walk. Not a day's walk, not a week's walk. We're talking about migrations across entire continents, following the last remaining water sources, the last patches of vegetation, the last animals that hadn't already moved on. Archaeological evidence from this period shows something extraordinary. Trade networks appear in the record for the first time. Shells from the Indian Ocean coast found hundreds of kilometers inland. Red ochre, a pigment used for body decoration and possibly ritual, suddenly being transported across vast distances. Pieces of the same distinctive stone tool technology appearing simultaneously in sites separated by 1,000 kilometers. These weren't coincidences. These were humans doing something they had never needed to do before, building relationships across distance, reaching out to groups they had never met, and establishing the kind of trust that lets you share resources when everything is scarce. The drought didn't just test your ancestors physically, it forced them to become social in a way no animal had ever been before. But movement and trade weren't enough for everyone. Some groups found a different solution. They went to the edge of the world they knew. Specifically, they went to the coast. The Pinnacle Point cave sites on the southern tip of South Africa hold some of the most important evidence of what happened next. Perched on cliffs above the Indian Ocean, these caves were occupied by small groups of humans at the height of the drought. And what archaeologists found inside them changed everything we thought we knew about early human cognition. These people were eating shellfish, systematically, methodically, at scale. This matters more than it sounds. Shellfish are not obvious food. They don't run away, they don't fight back, but they are also not something a primate brain immediately recognizes as nutrition. To eat a shellfish, you need to understand that something edible is hidden inside something inedible. You need to crack it open, extract the meat, and understand that this is worth doing. This is abstract thinking applied to survival. And these humans were doing it 120,000 years ago, under pressure, in conditions that were killing everything else around them. But the shellfish weren't the most significant discovery at Pinnacle Point. Inside those caves, archaeologists found something that should not exist at that age: pigment, red ochre, ground into powder, mixed with other compounds applied to surfaces. The oldest known evidence of humans making and using paint. Not for hunting, not for tools, for meaning. In the middle of the worst drought in their history, with their population collapsing and their world turning to dust, your ancestors stopped and made art. Anthropologists argue about what the ochre was for: body decoration, symbolic communication, early ritual. Nobody knows for certain, but what everyone agrees on is this: symbolic thinking, the ability to use one thing to represent another, is the single cognitive leap that separates humans from every other animal that has ever lived. And your ancestors made that leap in the dark, during a catastrophe, when it would have been far easier to simply stop. There is a theory that says the drought is not just a context for this leap. The drought is the cause. When resources are abundant, animals, including humans, don't need to communicate in complex ways. You can see the food, you can smell the water, You can follow the herd. No language required. But when everything disappears, the only advantage left is information. Who knows where the last water is? Who has food they're willing to share? Which path leads somewhere that isn't dead? The groups that survived were the ones that could communicate these things, not just with gestures and calls, but with symbols, with ochre marks that carried meaning across time and space, with trade goods that said, "We are the same kind of people," with stories told around fires that kept knowledge alive for the next generation. The drought forced language, or at least the drought forced the version of language we actually use, the one built not just for sharing information, but for building identity, for saying, "I am part of your group. We share the same symbols. You can trust me." The humans who made it through weren't necessarily the strongest, or the fastest, or the most individually capable. They were the ones who could convince a stranger to share their last water. They were the ones who could remember a story about where the good springs were, told by a grandmother who had walked those paths 40 years earlier. They were the ones who could mark a path so that the people coming behind them would know which way to go. Language, memory, symbolic thinking, trust built across distance, all of it born from drought, all of it born from catastrophe. Here's what scientists believe happened at the end of the bottleneck. The rains came back, slowly at first, then more fully. The lakes began to refill. The vegetation returned, the animals came back, and the few thousand humans who had survived, scattered across coastlines and cave systems and highland refuges, began to expand again. They carried with them everything the drought had forced them to build: the symbolic language, the long-distance trade networks, the ability to cooperate with strangers, the ochre and the ritual, and the stories that made them a people rather than just a group of individuals trying to stay alive. Within 50,000 years, those survivors had walked out of Africa and colonized the entire planet. Every desert, every Arctic tundra, every island chain, every rainforest. No other species in the history of life on Earth has done anything remotely like it. And it started with a drought. It started with the rain stopping and a group of humans going to the edge of the ocean and eating shellfish out of desperation and painting the walls of their caves because something inside them needed to make meaning even when meaning was the last luxury they could afford. The next time the world feels like it's drying out. The next time everything you relied on disappears. The next time you find yourself at the edge looking at a world that doesn't look like the one you planned for. Remember what your ancestors did. They didn't just survive, they invented everything that makes us human. And they did it in the dark, with nothing left, on the edge of a cliff, above a sea they had never crossed.